Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your essential sources, cut through the noise, and deliver the insights straight to you. Today, we are marching right into the heart of one of the ancient world's most formidable, unique, and often misunderstood societies, Sparta.
It's true. When you hear Sparta, the first thing that probably comes to mind is that legendary, unwritten constitution, the Great Rhetra, right? The system that supposedly created the perfect soldier.
That's the usual story.
That's the typical expectation. But what's genuinely fascinating about the historical material you've shared with us for this deep dive is how little, really, how little focus there is on Sparta's internal domestic legal world. It's almost absent.
Absolutely. It seems we are looking at Sparta primarily through the eyes of its neighbors, its rivals like Athens, and, well, historians documenting its actions abroad.
Exactly.
The sources seem to focus less on, say, how Spartans resolved property disputes and far more sharply on Sparta's external identity. Its role as this, unyielding military power, the great imperial rival to Athens. And crucially, what these sources really highlight is a state defined by the fundamental structural limits of its own institutions.
So our mission today, therefore, isn't really to try and reconstruct the blueprint for their perfect military city from these texts, because the details just aren't here.
Right.
Instead, we're going to analyze the case file, so to speak, on their foreign policy. We'll look at Sparta's actions, its military profile, and that institutional inertia, that rigidity that ultimately seems to have stopped it from successfully becoming a major imperial power like Athens managed for a time.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at Sparta through the lens of its external power and political limitations. And maybe the best place to start is where the world first really understood Sparta's terrifying military credibility: the Persian Wars.
Right. When we place Sparta in the context of the wider Greek world, its identity is just completely tied up with its position as the acknowledged military leader of the Hellenic Confederacy. Maybe sometimes a reluctant leader, but the leader nonetheless.
And this comes across most vividly, of course, during the defense against Xerxes.
Definitely. And while the legend, understandably, focuses on Leonidas and the 300, which is an incredible story,
Of course.
the sources we have give us that necessary context. They help us understand Sparta's actual contribution to the overall effort at a place like Thermopylae.
It wasn't just 300 Spartans holding the pass alone, was it?
Not at all. The sources mention 1,500 Lacedaemonian hoplites. They were certainly the elite corps, the command structure, we could say, but they were operating alongside a massive allied force, about 10,000 troops from various other Greek states.
That distinction feels important.
It's crucial, I think. Sparta's military strength wasn't just the raw fighting ability of its homoioi, its full citizens, but also that diplomatic and, cultural weight that allowed it to command a multinational force of that size.
But that command wasn't always straightforward, was it? There were often delays and internal politics involved.
Always. We see that tension between military necessity and cultural commitments almost immediately in the sources. There are these allegations recorded that the main Peloponnesian force was deliberately delayed in deploying.
Why? What was holding them up?
They were apparently tied up by observing the Carnian religious festival and also the Olympic Games.
So religious duties potentially taking precedence over an existential military threat.
Well, it certainly looks like it demonstrates a commitment to their own internal cultural norms that, sometimes at least, seem to supersede immediate external military needs, at least until the situation got absolutely desperate.
But the fighting didn't stop entirely.
No. While the land forces were debating the timing around festivals, the sources show the Confederate fleet was still active, moving near Euboea in the straits off the mainland. So the military necessity holding that critical pass at Thermopylae under Mount Oea remained paramount. But those internal constraints, the festivals, the games, they were always a factor bubbling under the surface.
And this military focus, even when operating within Greece itself, often led to a very clear, very pragmatic, and sometimes, let's be honest, manipulative geopolitical strategy.
Additionally.
Let's look at their actions during the early conflicts with Athens, especially what they were doing in Boeotia.
Yeah, the sources are really quite explicit here. Sparta wasn't just aiming for a quick tactical victory or raid. After the success against Persia, Sparta immediately faced a no long-term political threat: a newly confident and rapidly expanding Athens.
So Athens was the new problem.
Pretty much. And the clear policy goal for Sparta became crafting a strategic counterweight to Athenian power.
Okay, so how did they go about executing that counter-aid policy? What did they actually do?
They used their military muscle to reshape the political map of central Greece. The sources state very clearly it was the explicit policy of Sparta to strengthen Thebes.
Thebes.
Yeah.
Not typically a close Spartan ally, were they?
Not always, no, but strategically vital. Sparta wanted to make Thebes the designated master of the Boeotian Federation. And this wasn't a natural alliance taking shape. Sparta actively used its leverage, its military presence, to coerce other Boeotian cities into joining this revived Theban-led league.
So forcing them into line behind Thebes.
Exactly. The goal was simple: raise up a powerful state right on Athens' immediate northern border, strategically positioned to hold Athens in check for the long haul.
That sounds like a pretty smart, forward-thinking strategy to box Athens in.
It does. But even the most brilliant generals can get tripped up by basic logistical realities. And our sources revealed this moment of, well, real embarrassment for the Peloponnesian army right after they'd accomplished their goals in Boeotia.
What happened?
They found themselves effectively trapped.
Trapped. The mighty Spartan army.
Well, yeah. Once their work was done, Thebes strengthened. The Boeotian League reformed under Theban leadership. The immediate problem became, how do we get home safely to the Peloponnesus? And suddenly, their dominant land power position just evaporated.
Why? What were the obstacles?
Marching back through the Megarid, the region around Megara, became extremely dangerous. The Athenians, who were obviously acutely aware of the Spartan army nearby, had beefed up their security and held the critical passes on the Isthmus of Corinth.
Okay, so the land route was blocked. What about going by sea? Across the Gulf?
That was a non-starter too. Crossing the Corinthian Gulf was judged unsafe because Athenian naval vessels were actively patrolling. They essentially put a naval block on the Spartan army's path home.
Wow. So the premier land power of Greece was stuck, logistically cornered by Athenian control of the passes and the sea lanes? That's a huge
A
embarrassment.
profound strategic embarrassment, yes.
So what was the only option left when their preferred routes home were closed off?
It forced a complete change of plan, a pivot in their campaign. Out of this embarrassment, this necessity, they resolved to march straight upon Athens itself.
Directly on Athens.
Directly on Athens, which was, at that very moment, busy building the famous long walls connecting the city down to its port, Piraeus. This march wasn't initially planned as an invasion of Attica. It was a direct consequence of their failure to secure a safe passage home. A stark illustration of how logistical constraints could dictate high strategy for Sparta.
And what's fascinating here, reading the sources, is that this immediate military necessity, the march on Athens, seems to have been instantly exploited by internal Athenian political factions.
Absolutely. They weren't marching against a united Athenian city.
No.
That dynamic is just constant throughout this whole era, the Peloponnesian War period. The sources suggest that the march upon Athens was very likely encouraged, perhaps even suggested, by a specific internal Athenian party.
Which one?
The oligarchs. These aristocratic, anti-democratic factions within Athens saw the Peloponnesian army's presence as a golden opportunity, a chance to overthrow the existing democracy with foreign help.
So Sparta gets drawn into Athens's internal power struggles.
It illustrates perfectly that Sparta's military actions were consistently interwoven with the political civil conflicts raging within other Greek cities. They often found themselves intervening, whether intentionally or not, on the side of anti-democratic movements.
And this confrontation ultimately led them right up to the Attic frontier for the Battle of Tanagra. Can you give us the scale of that clash, the numbers involved?
Sure. The Athenians marched out to meet the Peloponnesian army. They fielded approximately 14,000 troops, and that included a significant contingent of 1,000 Argives, who were Athenian allies, and also some Thessalian cavalry.
And the outcome.
The Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, and their allies gained the victory. It was a Spartan win on the battlefield. But the sources immediately undercut the strategic significance of this victory.
How so?
The primary consequence wasn't the subjugation of Athens or the destruction of its army. The main result of the Spartan victory at Tanagra was simply that the victors secured the ability to finally return home safely via the isthmus.
So the battle was essentially fought to clear their path home.
Exactly. The victory itself was merely a tactical means to achieve the immediate, pressing objective of safe transit. It basically reversed the logistical failure they had just suffered.
It really emphasizes how, even at the height of their military success in a major battle, Spartan operations were often constrained by these very practical, geographic, logistical limits.
Yes, it highlights the strategic reality for them. Even a significant land victory like Tanagra was ultimately worth less to Sparta in that moment than securing their exit route back to the Peloponnesian heartland. The focus remained intensely, almost stubbornly, regional.
And it's right here, in the immediate aftermath of this really destructive battle, that we see this unexpected glimmer of diplomatic pragmatism, something that actually seems to transcend the immediate military conflict and involves the banished Athenian statesman Cimon.
Yes, Simon. A fascinating figure. He had been ostracized, exiled by his own city, Athens, but he shows up at the Athenian camp, which was actually pitched on Boeotian soil near Tanagra, and he asks for permission to fight for Athens, his city, against the Spartans.
Even though Athens had exiled him.
Even though they'd exiled him. Now, the Athenian Council of 500, the governing body, actually denied his request. They were suspicious, perhaps, but his sheer, unflagging loyalty, despite his personal grievance, despite his exile, was apparently deeply moving to everyone who witnessed it.
And didn't his personal friends and supporters fight extra fiercely in the battle to prove his loyalty?
They did. The sources say Simon's partisans fought so fanatically that none of them survived the battle. They died proving his and their own commitment to Athens.
What was the political impact back in Athens of this act of loyalty from exile?
It was immense. That display of loyalty, culminating in the sacrifice of his followers, completely paved the way for Simon's political rehabilitation. Athens had just suffered a terrible slaughter at Tanagra. They desperately needed stability. They needed time to recover.
And someone saw Cimon as the key to getting that time.
Pericles himself, interestingly enough, his great political rival.
Uh-huh.
Pericles recognized the need of the hour and actually moved for Simon's recall from exile.
Why Cimon specifically?
Because Cimon had traditionally good relations with Sparta. He was seen as the one person who could potentially negotiate a truce.
And did he?
He did. Cimon successfully negotiated a truce with Sparta, buying Athens crucial time. And then, demonstrating incredible personal restraint and political savvy, he tactfully withdrew from Athens again afterwards. He didn't want to complicate the internal democratic politics by sticking around. He prioritized the state's security over his own immediate political ambition.
It's an amazing episode. It really demonstrates that while Sparta might be the rigid military champion on the battlefield, Athenian diplomacy, which was fueled by these complex internal politics, rivalries, and sometimes these dramatic displays of individual loyalty, could sometimes be the deciding factor in securing essential ceasefires and buying the city crucial breathing room.
Diplomacy as a weapon, in a way.
Exactly.
Okay, so if Section 1 established Sparta as this capable but definitely regionally constrained military power,
Right.
Section 2, I think, reveals the fundamental and ultimately fatal flaw in their political model, especially when they tried to make that leap from just being a regional power to becoming an imperial overlord across the Aegean.
And they start the Great War against Athens, the Peloponnesian War, the sources tell us, with the highest possible moral justification.
Oh, absolutely. The propaganda was powerful. They claimed they were being reluctantly pressed into action, forced to undertake the destruction of the Athenian Empire.
And why was the Athenian Empire supposedly so bad?
Because, according to the Spartan narrative and echoed by many Greeks, it was seen as an outrage on the Greek sentiment of political independence. Athens was portrayed as the tyrant city.
So Sparta's stated purpose, its public goal, was liberation.
Precisely. To restore liberty to those Greek states supposedly enslaved by Athens. The promise was clear. Once the Athenian tyranny was broken, Sparta would step back, leave the liberated cities free to govern themselves according to their own customs.
A noble cause, on the face of it.
And very appealing to many Greek states chafing under Athenian rule.
But what's fascinating here is, the sources say they completely abandoned this high moral ground the moment they actually achieved victory.
Yes, it's quite stark.
After the decisive naval battle, the destruction of the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami in 405 BC, they finally had the chance to fulfill that promise, to step back. What did they do instead?
They threw morality right out the window. The sources state quite bluntly that once the Athenian Empire was destroyed, Sparta cynically set aside her high moral professions.
Cynically. That's a strong word from the historian.
It is. And what did they do? They resolved to take dominion themselves over the very cities they had supposedly gone forth to deliver. They decided, quite frankly, to step into Athens' shoes, to take over the Athenian inheritance and pursue imperial power across the Aegean Sea.
Okay, this seems like a pretty short-sighted choice, maybe driven by greed or ambition. But why were they institutionally incapable of succeeding, where Athens had, at least for a time, managed to hold an empire together? Why couldn't they just manage the empire like Athens did?
This is the core analytical point that comes out of these sources, I think. It goes right back to the deep-seated nature of her institutions and the character of her genius, as one source puts it.
The Spartan way of life itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Spartan institutions were, by their very design, intended for activity only within the Peloponnesus. They were laser-focused on internal discipline, on constant military readiness, and, crucially, on the control of the huge population of enslaved Helots at home. That was the priority.
So what were the specific institutional rigidities? Can you break down the mechanics of why age and dominion was impossible for them?
Sure. I think we can identify 3 primary mechanics of failure embedded deep within the Spartan system, based on what the sources imply or state.
Okay, number 1.
First, the incredibly small number of full Spartan citizens. The elite fighting force, the homaioi, the equals, was always tiny. Maybe it never exceeded 8,000 men at its absolute peak, and it was rapidly declining throughout this period due to constant warfare and, just as importantly, the inherent difficulty of actually maintaining full citizen status under their strict rules.
So not many Spartans to go around.
Very few. And this tiny elite group was designed primarily to govern and police the massive oppressed Helot population back home in Laconia and Messenia. They simply lacked the manpower necessary to garrison and administer hundreds of complex island and coastal states scattered across the Aegean.
You couldn't send the army abroad because you needed to keep the lid on things at home.
Precisely. They couldn't export the machine because every single cog, every Spartan citizen, was needed domestically just to prevent a Helot revolt, which was their constant fear.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second mechanical failure?
Second, their economic and financial system, or maybe the lack thereof. Sparta was famously, almost pathologically, averse to complex finance, to trade, to coinage in the way other Greeks understood it.
To use those iron bars, right? Propellers.
Exactly, clunky iron bars, which made external trade incredibly difficult and, more importantly, made the systematic collection of imperial revenue, the kind of tribute, the phoros, that Athens relied upon to fund its fleet and administration, basically impossible for them.
How can you run an empire without money?
You really can't, not a maritime one anyway. Running a naval empire requires ships, it requires paid garrisons, it requires diplomats and administrators. Sparta simply lacked the essential financial bureaucracy, the expertise, even the mindset. Their kings and their ephors, the elected magistrates, might have been brilliant at leading armies, but they were completely unequipped to manage complex customs duties, naval budgets, or the intricate diplomatic infrastructure needed for an empire.
So no manpower, no money system. What's the third major failure point?
The third is the fundamental inability to adapt or expert the Helot system. The entire Spartan citizen life, the agog training system, the communal messes, all of it was predicated on the existence of the Helots. These were state-owned slaves, Greeks enslaved by Spartans, who worked the land and produced the food that freed the homaioi to train for war constantly.
Right, the foundation of their whole society.
Absolutely. But you cannot export this system. You can't just pick up the Helots and move them to administer Samos or Chios, and you certainly couldn't force the populations of those sophisticated Aegean islands, who saw themselves as free Greeks, into the same rigid, brutal status as Helots, without provoking massive, immediate, and constant revolt. Sparta simply had no template, no model for governing other free Greeks who were not essentially subjugated agricultural workers like the Helots.
So the sources basically predict, and history proved them right, that this path of imperial aggrandizement, this attempt to take over Athens' empire, inevitably led to calamity.
Yes, because their institutions were just too rigid, as one text says, to be adapted to the enlarged sphere of an Aegean dominion.
Failure was baked into the system.
It seems unavoidable looking back. This institutional inertia meant they could really only govern the former Athenian allies through crude military force. They installed Spartan military governors called harmosts and propped up narrow, unpopular oligarchic regimes in the cities. This approach quickly created deep resentment and instability across the Aegean.
And the ultimate result?
Ultimately, their failure, the collapse of their short-lived empire, forced Sparta to eventually retreat back into the purely Peloponnesian position, the regional power role for which its internal structures were actually designed. The attempt at empire was fundamentally a catastrophic structural mismatch.
In this underlying tension, Sparta inherently backing rigid, aristocratic, oligarchic systems, while Athens, for all its flaws, championed democracy. This had a massive impact on political alignments across the entire Greek world, didn't it?
Yeah.
Far beyond just the Peloponnesus.
Oh, absolutely. The Peloponnesian War really solidified that ideological divide across Greece. The sources are clear. The aristocracy, the wealthy landowners, the traditional elites in various Greek cities, we see it very clearly in a place like Corcyra during its brutal civil war, were almost unanimously in favor of Sparta.
Why Sparta?
They favored the stability, the discipline, the predictable, centralized authority that Sparta represented. It seems safer for their interests.
And the other side.
Conversely, the mass of the people, the demos, the Democrats in these cities, were consistently favorable to Athens. They saw Athens as the primary guarantor of popular rule, of democratic government. So the war became an ideological struggle fought out city by city.
And that inherent aristocratic bias in Spartan policy, their tendency to impose oligarchies, eventually led to such widespread oppression under their brief imperial rule that it directly caused the rival power they had just destroyed, Athens, to make a surprising comeback.
Yes, exactly. The heavy-handedness of Spartan rule, the oppression under the Harmists, and the oligarchies they supported was the direct trigger for the formation of the Second Athenian Confederacy.
A new Athenian league.
A new league, yes, established in 377 BCE during the archonship of a man named Nausinicus. And the charter of this new league explicitly stated its purpose: to protect the independence of the Greek states against the oppression of Sparta. It was formed directly in reaction to Spartan imperialism.
So Sparta's actions created the very alliance designed to counter them.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that Athens seems to have learned some bitter lessons from its first empire's failures. The constitutional framework of this new league deliberately put in safeguards to try and prevent their own dominance from becoming tyrannical again.
How did they do that? What safeguards?
Well, the documents detailing the formation of this Second Confederacy show really painstaking efforts to avoid replicating past Athenian imperial mistakes. For instance, they strictly prohibited the old practice of Athenian outsettling, meaning sending Athenian citizens, kleros, to live on allied lands, which had been a major source of friction.
Okay, no more Athenian colonists taking allied land. What else?
And maybe even more significantly, they changed the terminology for the financial contributions from the allies.
How so?
Athens very carefully avoided using the old imperial word phoros.
Which meant tribute, basically. Tax.
Exactly. Phoros clearly implied subjugation, a tax paid by subjects to an imperial master. Instead, the new league demanded syntaxes.
Syntaxes, what does that translate to?
It translates more like contributions or co-payments, a much more collaborative term.
That word change from phoros to syntaxes feels like a fascinating window into political sensitivity, doesn't it?
It really is. It was meant to signal a partnership rather than a mandate. It framed the financial arrangement as a collective military funding effort among equals, rather than an imperial tax imposed from above.
A deliberate rebranding based on past failures.
A crucial signal, yes. The whole legal structure of this new league was intentionally designed to foster and protect political independence, explicitly reacting against the backdrop of recent Spartan tyranny. So, Sparta, by failing to adapt its rigid, military-centric institutions to the complex realities of running a flexible financial and political empire, essentially created the vacuum and the motivation necessary for its democratic rival Athens to return stronger and perhaps a bit smarter, institutionally speaking.
Okay, so the narrative so far has really painted Sparta as this state defined by its military focus and its collective, almost simplistic social structure, whose institutions, as you said, were just too rigid for the political complexity of managing an empire across the Aegean. To truly grasp how radical this Spartan simplicity was, especially in its legal culture, I think we need to zoom in, just for contrast, on their great rival, Athens. Because Athens was a society fundamentally obsessed with complex, detailed, and very public written law.
Athens really does set the absolute standard for legal complexity in the ancient Greek world, and it serves as the perfect foil, the perfect contrast to help us understand the Spartan difference highlighted in these sources.
How so? What characterized Athenian law?
Well, Athenian democracy operated through procedures that were highly formalized, meticulously documented, very public, and often incredibly lengthy. They utilized specific, highly regulated methods for bringing prosecutions, like dikai.
Those were private suits, right, between individuals.
Correct. And braphi, which were public indictments where any citizen could bring a case concerning matters affecting the whole community. The system was built on public participation and written statutes.
And this legal obsession, this reliance on procedure, extended right to the very top levels of government, didn't it? There were mechanisms to ensure public scrutiny of anyone holding power.
Absolutely. They had these complex checks on magistrates before they even took office.
What was it called again?
It was called dokimasia. Every single newly elected Athenian official, before they could assume their duties, had to be subjected to this rigorous public examination.
Rigorous how? What did they check?
This wasn't just a formality, not a rubber stamp at all. It was often a deep inquiry held perhaps before the Senate, the Council of 500, and it concerned the candidates' probity, their honesty, their character. It looked into their family background, whether they fulfilled their civic duties like military service, whether they treated their parents properly, and even checked their property qualifications.
So it wasn't enough just to be talented or popular enough to get elected. You had to publicly prove your accountability, your good character, and maybe that you weren't financially desperate enough to be easily corrupted.
Precisely. The whole system was designed to ensure transparency and accountability before someone wielded public power. Furthermore, there were requirements, for some offices at least, that magistrates had to possess property, specifically real estate within Attica. This demonstrated they had a tangible stake, a permanent investment, in the community's stability and well-being.
So the entire process of dokimasia served as this public accountability mechanism.
Yes, and it's something entirely alien, as far as we can tell from these sources, to the more secretive, hierarchical, and less publicly scrutinized structure of Spartan governance.
Let's look at Athenian homicide law for another example. This seems to illustrate that procedural obsession even more starkly, going way back to the foundational laws attributed to Draco.
Right. Draco's original homicide law from the 7th century BC mandated a very specific legal and ritualistic procedure. It was designed to ensure the state's role in managing vengeance was visible and formally acknowledged.
What did it involve?
The victim's relatives, the ones seeking justice, were required by law to issue a formal public proclamation against the accused killer.
Where would they do this?
Either in public, and the text uses the phrase onagori, literally in the marketplace, the civic heart of the city, or sometimes it seems to have been associated with a ritual at the victim's graveside.
So this public declaration, right in the middle of the city, served to formally establish the state of enmity. It put the accusation out there officially, leaving no doubt about the ongoing legal conflict.
Exactly. It brought the private grievance into the public legal sphere right from the start. And by the classical period, the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the procedure became even more layered, even more formalized.
How so?
Before a full homicide trial, a dikiphono could even begin, 2 formal proclamations had to be issued. First, the initial one by the victim's relatives, as per Draco's law, but then a second, official proclamation had to be issued by the basileus.
Who was the basileus again?
He was one of the chief elected magistrates, the archon basileus, who specifically superintended religious matters and the homicide courts. His official proclamation essentially confirmed the legality of the prosecution and formally barred the accused from temples and public spaces, maintaining the ritual purity of the city while the case was pending.
Wow. That's layers upon layers of public state-sanctioned procedure just to get a murder trial started. It really shows the state's deep immersion in the minutiae of legal process.
It absolutely does.
The Athenians also had this really fascinating, almost bureaucratic way of punishing citizens without actually executing them or formally exiling them, the legal status known as atimia.
Ah, atimia, yes.
It wasn't just social shame, was it? It seems like a complex, legally defined removal of civic rights, all spelled out in written law.
It was. Atimia, which literally means the loss of time, honor, value, or rights, was a very specific and severe legal penalty. And importantly, the sources suggest it was typically imposed only upon male citizens, and usually for offenses committed specifically in their capacity as citizens, things like cowardice in battle, bribery, embezzlement of public funds.
So what rights did you actually lose if you were declared atimos?
You lost the essential rights of active citizenship. Most critically, you lost the right to speak or vote in the assembly, the sovereign body of Athens. You couldn't hold public office, you couldn't serve on a jury, and you couldn't appear in court as a litigant, either prosecuting or defending, or even as a witness in most cases.
Okay, this raises an important question. If it stripped you of all your active political and legal rights, was it basically the same as being exiled from Athens? Did you have to leave?
No, not formally, and this is where the legal system's complexity really shines through. The sources are quite clear that atimia was not formal exile. The atimos, the person suffering atimia, technically remained in Athens. They could still live there, own property, and, crucially, they retained the basic protection of the law. Killing an atimos was still considered the murder of an Athenian citizen, subject to prosecution.
Okay, so you could stay, but you couldn't do anything civic. But what stopped an atomos from just, ignoring the ban and trying to speak in the assembly anyway?
Well, the system had a devastating catch, a powerful enforcement mechanism.
Which was?
If an atomos attempted to exercise any of the rights he had legally lost, like trying to enter the assembly, or going to the agora during assembly meetings, or attempting to bring a lawsuit, he became subject to a summary procedure known as apagoge.
Apagoge. What did that involve?
It literally means leading away. It allowed any full citizen who witnessed the violation to immediately arrest the atomos on the spot, without a warrant, and haul him before the magistrates, usually the 11, who are responsible for prisons and executions.
And what happened then?
If the case was clear-cut, the penalty was often summary execution, known as apotompanismos. This could involve beating or, horrifyingly, binding the person to a plank, tumpanon, to die of exposure or strangulation.
Good grief. So the penalty for violating Athenia, for trying to act like a citizen when you weren't allowed to, was immediate arrest by any bystander and likely a brutal public execution.
That seems to be the implication. The threat was so severe, so immediate, and so public that it often made voluntary exile the much preferable, safer option for someone declared atomos, even though exile wasn't the formal, legally mandated sentence. The system regulated social and political behavior through this incredibly complex but brutally enforceable written legal threat.
Okay, so when we put this incredibly detailed Athenian system side by side with what the sources tell us about Sparta, the Athenian system with its dokimesia vetting officials, its double public proclamations just to start a homicide case, and its complex, enforceable civil penalties like Athenia, backed by the threat of summary execution. The contrast with Sparta is, it's deafening, isn't it?
It really is the sound of silence in these particular sources regarding Spartan internal law. While we know from other traditions that Sparta's constitution, the Great Rhetra, was legendary and deeply respected, why do these historical accounts mention virtually none of this kind of detailed legal infrastructure?
Right. We hear about Spartan kings like Aegeus I, the Aegean dynasty, Aegeus II later on, which implies a monarchy or their unique dual kingship. But we hear nothing in these texts about public trials for ordinary Spartans, detailed prosecution procedures, specific written statutes governing contracts or property, or formalized public law beyond the collective rules of the Agos, their brutal education and training system.
There's just a void in these particular accounts where the Athenian legal detail would be.
And this absence, this silence, especially when set against the overwhelming detail we have for Athenian legal procedures, it seems to reinforce the main contention that emerges from these sources. That Sparta, as perceived by outsiders and historians focusing on its external role, was fundamentally a state where military discipline, collective obedience, and the demands of controlling the Helots superseded the need for elaborate written civil statutes or complex public litigation to resolve individual disputes or manage political life.
It suggests that the law in Sparta, at least in the way it mattered for their external power projection and institutional character, was the system itself, the rigid social structure, the military hierarchy, the absolute demand for conformity. It was a system designed, perfected even, for forging the ultimate military collective.
But not for managing the messy complexities of individual rights or diverse economies or the bureaucratic and political administration needed to run an empire.
Exactly. It was structurally unfit for empire precisely because its legal and social genius, if you want to call it that, lay in its intense, focused rigidity and simplicity, whereas empire, almost by definition, demands flexibility, complexity, adaptation, and sophisticated legal and financial tools, all the things Athens had, and Sparta, according to these sources, profoundly lacked.
Okay, so we began this deep dive, really seeking to understand Sparta not through its internal myths, but through its external actions and the institutional limits revealed by the historical sources provided. And I think the material has painted a really consistent portrait, hasn't it? A portrait of a state caught between its initial, almost terrifying military success and its ultimate, seemingly unavoidable political failure on the larger stage.
I think the synthesis is quite clear, yes.
Yeah.
Sparta is defined first and foremost in these sources by its core military identity. It was capable of leading broad Greek Confederate forces, as we saw in the Persian Wars, and securing important tactical victories like the one at Tanagra. And it was also defined by its very clear-eyed, pragmatic, strategic foreign policy goals, like the deliberate strengthening of Thebes, specifically to check Athenian growth.
And crucially, we saw that even its successful tactical movements, like the victory at Tanagra, were often dictated not by grand ambition, but by immediate strategic imperatives, like the difficulty of securing safe passage home.
Right. That whole episode highlighted how Sparta's renowned military prowess was always, fundamentally, hemmed in by geography, by logistics, by the need to get back to the Peloponnesus. The march on Athens itself was forced upon them by necessity, not chosen as part of a master plan for conquest at that moment.
And this structural inflexibility, this inherent rigidity we've discussed, proved absolutely fatal when Sparta finally achieved its ultimate military goal, the destruction of the Athenian Empire after the Peloponnesian War.
Yes. The attempt to step into Athens' shoes, to assume the mantle of Aegean dominion, failed catastrophically. And it failed, the sources strongly suggest, because Sparta's unique institutions, the ones that made it so strong internally, were completely incapable of managing a complex, maritime, financially driven empire.
You mean the small citizen body needed at home?
The tiny number of homoioi needed to control the Helots, yes.
The almost primitive financial system.
Their anti-commercial ethos and lack of monetary tools, correct?
And the utter dependence on the Helot system itself, which couldn't be exported.
Those factors combined meant their institutions, designed purely for internal control and military discipline within the Peloponnesus, simply broke when applied to the wider, more complex Aegean world.
So they successfully destroyed their great rival, Athens.
A huge military achievement.
But they were fundamentally incapable of effective governance or adaptation in the aftermath. They couldn't manage the victory, which ultimately forced them back into their regional shell and, ironically, inadvertently set the stage for Athens-controlled, more legally savvy return to power with the Second Confederacy.
It really is the ultimate historical irony, isn't it? Sparta, in this light, represents this powerful, almost chilling model of state success achieved through singular, intense focus, followed by dramatic political collapse brought on by that very same quality. Institutional inertia, the inability to change.
And the legal contrast is key here.
Absolutely. Athens, with all its internal chaos and factionalism, thrived, or at least survived and adapted, because of its reliance on the complexity of public written law designed, however imperfectly, to manage internal conflict, regulate external trade, and provide a framework for political life. Sparta's unyielding system, which deliberately avoided that kind of legal complexity in favor of military discipline, was only suitable for producing soldiers, not the sophisticated administrators or flexible policies needed for empire. And perhaps I can leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought based on these sources. They consistently demonstrate, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, how deeply the Spartan political elite, the aristocracy, the kings, the whole system was interwoven with anti-democratic movements right across the Greek world. So even without seeing the detailed internal mechanism of the Great Rhetra in these specific texts, we absolutely see the external projection of its core values, an unwavering preference for centralized militaristic authority, for oligarchy, and for rigid social discipline.
And the consequence of that bias?
Well, it meant that almost every time Sparta intervened abroad, whether invited or not, it inevitably stoked the flames of democratic resistance and resentment. It fundamentally undermined its own claims of liberation because the freedom Sparta offered usually meant rule by a narrow, pro-Spartan oligarchy, which wasn't freedom at all for the majority of citizens in those cities. Their ideology worked against their diplomacy.
So what does this all mean? It seems the great rival to Athenian democracy, Sparta, ultimately failed, not because of lack of hoplite, they clearly had that in abundance, but because its defining characteristic, its unyielding, structurally inflexible nature, was fundamentally incompatible with the complex political and commercial reality of empire in the Aegean world. And it suggests a timeless lesson, perhaps, that institutional rigidity, even when seemingly designed for perfection in a specific internal context like producing soldiers, can become the very seed of political failure when that institution is confronted with a dynamic, complex external world that demands adaptation. If you want to dig deeper into this fascinating contrast and see exactly how Spartan structural inflexibility played out in real time, I'd encourage you to explore some of the later historical accounts. Look into the specific actions of the Spartan kings we mentioned, the Aegids, or examine the precise diplomatic language and sticking points in treaties like the Peace of Nicias negotiated between Athens and Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. You could often see that institutional rigidity causing problems in concrete diplomatic and command situations.